Tuesday, November 4th, 1902. He denies all. Alan G. Mason insists he is not Jack the Slugger. He told relatives on night Agnes McPhee was assaulted he might be suspected of being the much-sought man. Man arrested says he can prove alibi if allowed time to recall his movements on nights in question. He is employed by his brothers, heads of the Mason and Hamlin firm. 3 times he has been an inmate of the McLean Insane Hospital. Alan Gregory Mason, 40 years old, was arrested this morning at his mother's home, 39 Newbury Street, charged with the murder of Miss Clara A. Morton at the McLean Insane Hospital grounds, Waverly, Saturday night. Mr. Mason, who is the son of the late Henry Mason, founder of the Mason and Hamlin organ business, is believed to be the man who committed the assaults upon women in Brookline, Cambridge, and Somerville. All of the Slugger cases are charged to him. The most valuable evidence is that connecting him with the crime at the McLean Hospital Saturday night. The identification of Mason on the grounds that night is considered to be very reliable. Mason declares that he is innocent. He admits that it was his practice to ride about on electric cars of evenings. He says he frequently went to Waverly because he grew fond of that territory while he was a patient at the McLean Hospital. He declares that he was not in Waverly Saturday night. He says that he went for a walk that evening, but does not remember what time he left home nor the hour of his return. Edward P. Mason, the suspected man's brother, says that his mother feels quite sure that Allen did not leave 39 Newbury Street until 9:30 p.m. Saturday. The time of his return is unknown. Family believes him innocent. His family believes the man to be innocent, as during a long talk with his elder brother after his arrest, he declared that he could tell everywhere he had been on the nights the several assaults occurred, if he had a chance to think over the dates. He did remember that on the night Agnes McPhee was killed in Somerville near the Cambridge line, he was taking a car ride through Cambridge. A suspicious character boarded the car and sat opposite to him. Mason said the man could not look him in the eye and acted as if he did not wish his face to be seen. Mason says, after that night, I became interested in the Slugger cases. I read the accounts of them, and I told my people that they could not suspect me. I asked them to remember where I was so that they would not suspect me. Mason was arrested at 8:45 this morning. State Detectives George Dunham and Fred A. Rhodes called at the house and inquired for Mr. Mason. When they were admitted to the apartment, Mrs. Henry Mason and her son Alan were in the dining room. They just finished breakfast, and Alan was reading a morning paper, perusing the account which indicated so strongly that he was the man suspected of the murder of the girl at Waverly. Detective Dunham told him that he was from the state police office and would like to have him go to the State House. "Oh, yes, I know," said he, folding up the paper. "You want me because you think I have been assaulting women. I expected you because one of the newspapers told me yesterday that you suspected me. They wanted to know where I was. I will go along, although I have nothing to do with this. I know nothing about it." He was handcuffed, taken down to a carriage by Detective Dunham, while Detective Rhodes locked the room he occupied and took the key. Mrs. Mason is not well, and she was greatly agitated by the appearance of the officers. She had intimation from the morning papers of the suspicion against her son. She told him to tell all he knew, and said she was confident that he knew nothing about the crime. Mason is easily agitated. The prisoner became very excited on the way down to the State House. He is easily agitated, and he grew more nervous on the way. He wrung his hands and kept saying that he knew nothing. "I can tell where I have been every night of these assaults," said he. "I can show that I was nowhere near the place where any of the girls were attacked at the time. I can bring people to show just where I was. I remember the night that the McPhee girl was killed in Somerville. I was riding on a car that night, coming through Cambridge. I noticed a tough-looking man sitting opposite to me. He looked and acted in such a peculiar way that my suspicion were aroused. I looked at him sharply, but he could not meet my gaze. When I read of the murder of Miss McPhee, I thought at once of that suspicious man. I spoke about it at home and told them where I was. I told them that they could not suspect me. I asked my folks to remember where I was that night so that they could not suspect me. I cannot see why anyone should have suspected me." Mason was brought into Chief Wade's office in the basement of the State House at 9 o'clock. He wore no overcoat, but had on checked sack coat and vest and dark trousers. When he was seated in Chief Wade's office, he was extremely nervous. He trembled, wrung his hands, and finally pulled out a handkerchief and pulled it and twisted it to control himself. He appeared like a man who was anxious to talk, but who could not think of anything to say. Chief Wade asked him a few questions, but all he could reply was that he did not know. The chief saw that he would have to handle him carefully, and he led him up to Saturday night at Waverly. Very fond of McLean Hospital. Mason said in answer to questions, "I used to be at the McLean Hospital. I always liked the place. Everyone treated me very nicely there. Since I left the hospital, I have visited it frequently. I have ridden out there on my bicycle and have gone there on the electric cars. I have spent many hours walking around the grounds and calling on some of the officials there. I am very fond of the associations of the hospital. I have been out there so much that I cannot give the exact date of my last visit. I was not in Waverly on Saturday night. I do not think I have been there since 3 or 4 days before Saturday. I do know that I did not go out there on my bicycle last week. It is rather hard for me to remember just where I have been, but on Saturday evening I went for a walk. I do not remember what time I left home, nor what time I returned at night. I do not believe anyone at Waverly would suspect me. They know me so well." Soon after, Chief Wade and Detective Neal started to examine Mason. His elder brother, Edward Palmer Mason, and Henry C. Tyler, who resides in the apartment house at 39 Newberry Street, arrived at the State House. The two men were admitted to the chief's private office and were present during the questioning of the prisoner. Alan Mason was somewhat reassured by the presence of his brother. He was solicitous of his mother. He said he did not worry about himself, but was afraid that the publication of his arrest would have a bad effect upon his mother's health. The man under arrest again protested to his brother his innocence of any knowledge concerning any one of the assaults. He told his brother that if he could collect his thoughts, he could remember where he had been every night in question. The elder Mason said he had made some inquiries at home and was convinced that Alan did not leave home Saturday evening until 9:30. Edward P. Mason's statement. Miss Morton was assaulted at 8:50 that evening at Waverly, which is a 40-minute ride on the electric cars from Boston. After the interview of the prisoner, Edward P. Mason said to the Globe reporter, "This is all a horrible mistake. My brother is absolutely innocent. I am sure, I am convinced that we will be able to show that he could not have been at the Waverly Saturday at the time the girl was killed. I remember that on Saturday night I was playing chess at my mother's, and that my brother Alan was there at the time. I am quite sure that I did not leave the house before 9:30. My brother himself, in the strongest language, denies the charges which are made. He's always been a truthful man, and I am perfectly sure that we will be able to prove his innocence. My brother has been employed about the factory every day. He has been there every day for weeks." The examination of Alan Mason convinced both Chief Wade and Detective Neal that the man is insane. "He unquestionably acted like a man who is unbalanced," said Mr. Neal. "It is very hard to question him, because though he answers, he is very suspicious. He has the desire to conceal which is dominant in the insane. He is not very clear where he was in the nights when the several assaults were committed, except that he is sure that he was not at Waverly. It is not strange that he does not recall where he was on the previous occasions. Our examination of him was principally concerning Waverly, and of course all connection with that crime he denies. 3 witnesses declare that they saw him at Waverly Saturday about dusk. We will send for them, ask them to look at Mason, and make sure of their testimony." Edward P. Mason discussed his brother's mental trouble with Chief Wade. He said that he was sure that his brother did not have the homicidal mania, nor was he ever excited to the point of violence. Restraint on him never necessary. Mr. Mason said that the prisoner had recently shown evidence of a marked improvement. He said that at no time in his life was it considered necessary to have him under restraint. Some 10 years ago, Alan, according to the older brother, met with a severe disappointment, and melancholia developed. He was sent to the McLean Hospital for treatment, and his condition was much improved. At various times, there have been a reoccurrence of symptoms of this aberration, but for the last year, Mr. Mason said his brother had apparently been steadily growing stronger. He worked at the factory in Cambridge every day, and in the evening seemed to take an active, healthy interest in walking and riding. He rode a bicycle a great deal during the summer, and spent many evenings riding through the suburbs on electric cars. Mr. Mason stated that his brother, even when he was most oppressed, was tractable. He could not conceive, he said, of the prisoner ever harboring resentment for a fancied grievance, and did not believe he would ever have the courage to attack anyone. Mr. Mason and Mr. Tyler were in Chief Wade's office for 2 hours. When they left, Mr. Mason said he intended to collect at once the facts which would establish his brother's innocence. Detective Dunham and Proctor and Chief Ryan of Belmont went to the Newberry Street house and searched the room occupied by Alan Mason this noon. They thought possibly they might find the watch was stolen from Miss Morton after the assault Saturday night. When they returned, the officer stated that they had not found anything which they believed had belonged to Miss Morton or to any one of the women who had been assaulted. Chief Inspector Murray called this noon to look at Mason and see if he conformed to the description given of the slugger in Cambridge. Mason is near collapse. Captain Murray of Cambridge said he did not feel justified in saying that Mason was or was not the probable assailant of Agnes McPhee. He intends to bring in witnesses who caught glimpses of the man who committed the Cambridge crimes to see if they can identify Mason. Alan Mason, under guard in Chief Wade's office, grew restless under the examination. Looking out of the windows, he saw a crowd of polling place loungers and others trying to see the man accused of the long series of assaults. The prisoner became actually alarmed for his personal safety. He thought the crowd meant a hostile sentiment. He became very excited about 1 o'clock. He got out of his chair and walked up and down, rubbing his hands and looking out of the windows. "I'm sure I'll be lynched if they try to take me out of here," he said to Chief Wade. "Those people are waiting to lynch me. I want you to protect me." He was told that the gathering indicated more curiosity, and many of them were there because the polling booth was on the next corner. Mason could not be reassured, explaining, "No, I know they will lynch me. I suppose the newspapers will have long accounts about me and everybody will be against me. If it could have been kept out of the papers, it would have been easy to show that I had nothing to do with this." The prisoner had obviously suffered intensely since morning. He was pale and bent when he was brought in this morning. This afternoon, the strain of the examination and inspection by the officers is telling on him. At 2 p.m., he was reported as very near to collapse. He could not remain quiet. He said he could not. He walked up and down Chief Wade's office, talking continually about his unfortunate position. "You have not caught him yet," he said. I have read these assaults. I think this man must be a very dangerous character. I should like to see him caught, as I am interested in it, but you have not caught him yet." He has stopped discussing the attack on Miss Morton. He does not try to explain anymore. In reply to all questions about the crime at Waverley and his whereabouts on that night, he now says, "I don't know anything about it." The man appears to be bright, and in his conversations with the detectives showed an agile mind, comprehending immediately the intent of the questions put to him. Mason will be kept at the State House during the day, that those who believe they saw him within the McLean Hospital grounds evening may look at him. John Carter of Waverley says he saw Mason near the hospital grounds Saturday at dusk. He says he knew Mason, but he will be given an opportunity to say whether, after seeing the man under arrest, he is positive of the identity of the person he saw at Waverley. In making the arrest, the detectives relied chiefly upon the statement of Mr. Carter and 2 other witnesses. They had not suspected Mason, but they did not feel justified in making the charge against him until they had placed him by reliable witnesses in Waverley the night Clara A. Morton was murdered. Mason family, an honored one. The family to which Alan G. Mason belongs has had a most interesting history of prominence for about a century. To different members of the family can be credited more of the musical progress that has been made in the United States than to any other source. Dr. Lowell Mason was famous the world over as a musician and as an author of music for more than half of the last century. His eldest son, William Mason, is regarded as the Nestor of music teachers in the United States today. Another son, Henry Mason, father of Alan Gregory Mason, was one of the founders of the Mason and Hamlin Company in Cambridge. Dr. Lowell Mason was born in Medfield, Massachusetts, January 1792. He was a descendant of Robert Mason, who came to America with Winthrop in 1630 and settled in Roxbury. Lowell Mason, as a boy, could play any musical instrument he came across, and later in life he gave all his attention to the study of music and published more than 50 volumes of hymn books, etc., which had a circulation of over 2 million copies. He led the choir in Lyman Beecher's Church on Bowdoin Street for years and founded the Boston Academy of Music in 1832. He married Abigail Gregory, and they were 4 sons. The eldest, William Mason, then Lowell Mason Jr., Daniel Mason, and Henry Mason. The youngest son, founder of the Mason and Hamlin Company and father of Alan G. Mason. The famous Jack Mason, the actor, and his brother Lowell Mason are sons of Daniel Mason, who, with his brother Lowell Mason Jr., did the publishing business in New York for years. It was about 40 years ago that Henry Mason, the youngest of the 4 sons of the famous Dr. Lowell Mason, took hold of a little business of manufacturing organs, which Mr. Hamlin had started sometime previously. Oliver Ditson had advanced Hamlin a little money towards starting that business, and it was on the strength of Mr. Ditson's advice that Henry Mason entered into partnership with Mr. Hamlin. They made a great success of the business. This Henry Mason had 4 sons: Edward P. Mason, who is now president of the Mason and Hamlin Company; Alan Gregory Mason, who has never taken an active interest in the business; Harry Mason, secretary of the company; and Daniel G. Mason, who is a professor of music in Princeton University. Insane and unpardonable sin. Alan G. Mason, shortly after leaving Harvard College in 1886, became something of a fanatic on religious matters. Then he got a strange idea into his head on which he was continually harping, much to the annoyance of his mother and of the other members of his family. He claimed that he committed the unpardonable sin for which he could neither be pardoned in this world nor the next. What that sin was he would not reveal. He would merely reiterate that it was the unpardonable sin. He grew moody and melancholy over this, and it was deemed expedient to put him in a sanitarium. He would apparently recover, but he seemed to have periodical relapses. He has been a suspect of much concern to his mother and other members of the family for years. He has been an inmate of the McLean Insane Asylum 3 times. He's also been in the Butler Sanitarium in Providence. The last time he went to the McLean Asylum was April 13th, 1901. He remained there 6 months. Since then has been doing some light work, keeping account of stock at the Mason and Hamlin factory in Cambridge. While in Harvard, he was very popular and owing to his musical talent belonged to the glee club, the Plerian Sodality, and was a member of the college orchestra. He was liked by his classmates and is said to have been a wrestler of considerable ability. He is 40 years of age. Details of Mason's life. Mason was very popular while in college. He belonged to many clubs and organizations and was much liked by all of the students in the classes above and below his with whom he came in contact. In his sophomore year, he was elected on the 5th 10 of the Institute of 1770 and was consequently a member of the exclusive secret organization Delta Kappa Epsilon. In his senior year, he was president of the University Glee Club, in which he sang first bass. In a social way, also, he was a decidedly prominent man in his class and was a popular member of the Hastings Pudding Club. In addition to being well known and generally liked by a large number of university acquaintances, he had a number of very close friends, all of whom regarded him as an exceptionally high-minded and clean-hearted gentleman. Charles Harrison, now of the First National Bank of Cincinnati, Ohio, was his roommate throughout the 4 years of their college course. Among his intimate friends were Colonel James A. Fry of the 1st Regiment Heavy Artillery, Massachusetts Volunteer Militia, Ebenezer H. Ferry, Vice President of the Shawmut National Bank of Boston, and Walter A. Edgerly of the stockbroking firm Edgerly & Crocker, 53 State Street, all of whom were shocked beyond measure when they learned this morning of the arrest of their former friend and classmate. It was not until after he had graduated from college that any of his intimate friends noticed anything of the way about Mason's actions or speech, and even then, for a long time, it was thought to be nothing more serious than a general depression of spirits, which those of his former classmates who still met him at times in the daily life of the business world did all in their power to dispel, grew more and more pessimistic. It was only a short time after Mason had left college that his acquaintances became aware that he was growing decidedly pessimistic in his views of life in general and oversensitive concerning his own utility in the world. Thinking that this change in him had been largely brought by his leaving the free and easy life of the university to enter the more serious field of work in the business world, a change of life which they argued would have marked effect on any extremely sensitive nature such as his, they tried to cheer him up as best they could by every means in their power, but to no avail. About this time he began work in his father's concern, the Mason and Hamlin Organ and Piano Company factory in Cambridge. Young Mason had always been extremely fond of music and had rather unusual talent in that time. In addition to the extra interest in which his appreciation for music gave to his work, he had always believed that it was his duty to take up his father's work in his turn, not only possibly to succeed him in the actual office at the head of the company, but also to succeed him in the success he had made in his avocation. He was abnormally conscientious in all he undertook. He worked hard in the factory, too hard, his friends thought, if he wanted to retain his health, and gradually, as the strain upon him became greater, he was possessed with the dread that something for which he was responsible in the factory could go wrong. Consequently, he redoubled his efforts, and his supervision of the particular branch of the industry for which he was accountable became more careful. Then his friends noticed that this idea of his, that he was of no use to society in general, which had first come to the surface when they had tried to dispel his melancholy tendencies, was rapidly growing to such proportions as to color almost all of his thoughts. In those days he was frequently known to say to one of his friends, "Look at you. You're getting on splendidly. I am not doing anything. I am no good to society." When the friend in question tried to cheer him up and to get this morbid idea out of his thoughts, he found it was impossible to argue with him on that subject. Nothing he could say, nothing he could do towards changing the direction of his friend's thoughts into a brighter channel seemed to have the slightest effect in making him take a more cheerful view of life. Mason would answer all arguments by persistently repeating that he could not see in what way he was of any use to the community. From time to time he spoke in this same general way to several of his former classmates. During this period he was working harder than ever at the factory. even with the growing notion that he was no good to anybody taking more and more possession of his thoughts. He evidently found it impossible to overcome the fear that this was not always there to attend to his work in person. Something would go wrong in his branch of the business for which he would be personally blamed. Sent to McLean Hospital. It did not take many months of this strain to break down his health and mind. He was sent to the McLean Hospital in Waverly to recuperate. On returning from the hospital, he again went to work in the organ factory. But after a short time, the old ideas of his uselessness and his dread of committing some blunder also returned, and it was not long before he broke down again and was sent back to the hospital. From this time on, it was generally acknowledged that his mind was seriously affected, and it was only at rare intervals that any of his friends saw him, and they lost practically all immediate trace of him. All they knew was that he was continually coming out and being sent back to the hospital. When they chanced to meet him, he had the appearance of a sick man. All of his friends speak of him as they knew him in his college days with the warmest expressions of affection. When one of them said today, all of the 86 men around here knew Alan Mason, and all of us were fond of him too, he expressed the general sentiment of those of his former classmates who still live in the vicinity of Boston. They speak of him as having a frank, clean-minded, gentle disposition, very sensitive, and exceptionally kind-hearted, the last man in the world any would possibly think could commit a murder. They said in those days he was of slight build and pale complexion. They speak of him as a most lovable gentleman. Edward K. Hamlin, president of the Metropolitan Coal Company, a former classmate and intimate friend of Mason, said, "He is one of the finest fellows that ever lived and one of the gentlest. When I heard the news this morning, I was never so shocked at anything in my life. During the time he was in Harvard, I never once noticed anything out about him." E. H. Ferry, vice president of the Shawmut Bank, said, "All of the men around here who knew him well feel this thing terribly. We are all very fond of him in college, and of course this thing has come as a great blow to us. It was not until he graduated from college that we first began to notice his growing melancholy tendency, and in spite of all we could do, we found it impossible to cheer him up. But while in Cambridge there was never any sign of this. He was a very popular man and had a number of good friends who liked him well." Series of crimes. Many mysterious attacks on women recently and no clue to the perpetrator.